Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Z and you're watching Dr. Z PhD, the place to be for expert info on gender. For many of you, the hardest thing about being trans is to deal with shame and guilt around being transgender. Many of you have asked me if this is my truth, if this is who I am, why do I still feel so ashamed? And that's exactly the question I'll answer for you today. So in this episode, I'll explain why many feel tremendous amount of shame and guilt about who they truly are, especially when it comes to family and if you have children. I'll also share a very important insight about shame and guilt that can help you move past it. And remember, if you want more info like this from me every Friday, go ahead and click that subscribe button so that way you don't miss any new content. Now let's talk about shame and guilt, especially why so many feel that way once they identify as transgender or even once they start their gender transition. Well, one of the reasons many of you feel this way is because shame and guilt about your gender, other than male or female, has been instilled in you ever since you were very little, pretty much ever since you were a baby. Let me explain what I mean by being instilled in you. Well, when you grow up with the idea that there is a right and a wrong way to do gender, for example, you can only be female or you can only be a male, then it becomes natural for you to suppress or even resist who you want to be in favor of what may feel safer or more socially acceptable. This suppression happens because you were taught, in both verbal as well as nonverbal ways, that straying outside of the gender norms is wrong. Maybe you were taught that it's disgusting, that it's embarrassing or even immoral to do. Many of you can look back at your childhood and remember a time when you expressed yourself in your desired true gender. And do you remember what happened? Chances are your parents probably scolded you for it. Your mom or even your dad told you your behavior is not appropriate, that it's wrong, that only boys can play with cars and only girls can wear dresses. Maybe you come from a religious background and you were told early on that your behavior is a sin, that you will be condemned in the eyes of God. Some of your parents may have actually enforced physical punishment for your behavior. You may have even been publicly shamed and ridiculed outside of home, maybe at school or maybe among your friends and peers. So think about what all of this does to a child. Think about what all of this may have done to you. Wouldn't it be normal and even expected to feel shame and guilt when your parents, your teachers, your friends, and everyone around you make you feel ashamed if you're not perfectly cis-normative? As a result, you develop these feelings at a very young age. And these feelings often stay with you throughout your life, all the way into your transition. And shame is a horrible emotion to live with, because shame is such a toxic poison that it can even convince you that you're making your identity up, that you're crazy and not normal, that you may have a mental illness or maybe a sexual fetish. It may make you question your transition, because deep down inside you may feel as if you're doing something very wrong and as if you're doing something very bad. But let me share something with you, and what I'm about to share is incredibly important for you to take away today. These feelings of shame and guilt that you feel or felt about who you are not yours. They may feel like your feelings because they arise out of your emotions, but they're really not your feelings. They're feelings of shame and guilt of our society, of our collective culture. And these feelings have been projected onto you early on by your parents, by your teachers, by your friends, and by your society. But they're not yours. As time goes on, you start feeling as if these are your own feelings, but they're really not. So please keep that in mind. Because in order to move past these feelings, you need to first recognize you have been carrying shame and guilt of our culture. And that's a horrible, horrible burden to bear. Now, I notice that those of you who are married, and especially have children, feel a bigger sense of shame and a bigger sense of guilt about your transgender identity. And that's usually primarily because you're carrying an additional sense of responsibility to your partners and to your kids. You may feel selfish transition because you don't want to put your children through it. Sometimes the worst case scenario is actually when your partner makes you feel shame and guilt when they tell you you're too selfish, that you're only thinking about yourself and not about your family, that you're destroying your marriage. And that's a terrible, terrible thing to put you through. But what they're really doing is projecting their own shame and guilt about transgender onto you. They're pushing their own transphobic feelings because they can't face or confront them. These are not your feelings, and it shouldn't be your responsibility to deal with your partner's transphobia. Your partner needs to be accountable and responsible for their own feelings. Let me ask you, what would you do if your child came out as trans? Would you reject them? Probably not. So let me ask you, why are you rejecting the biggest part of who you are? If we want to change collective shame and guilt that is being daily projected onto us, we need to start with embracing ourselves. We need to show people that we can be trans and not feel shame and guilt because there's nothing to feel shameful or guilty about. I know what I'm suggesting is very difficult. I also know that for many of you, it comes with actually losing loved ones. But I also know this. I know that if you don't embrace who you are, you will lose yourself. And that's a huge price to pay. I want you to think about this for a moment. Because if you lose yourself, if you're not who you truly are, then who are you? Who are you to your partner? Who are you to your kids? What about your family? These are difficult questions to ask yourself, and it may take you some time to get an answer. It may take you some time to rid yourself of shame and guilt that doesn't really belong to you. If you can take away anything from this video today, please take away a reminder that your feelings, these feelings of shame and guilt that may feel like yours, really belong to our closed-minded society. Now, I'd love to hear your comments, so please share your stories about shame and guilt and your feelings about it. And please don't forget to like this video. And if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. And I really look forward to seeing all of you next Friday. Bye.